Okay, great. Thank you. We have one. Thank you very much for that very, very informative session. I'm going to invite Sandra Lane back as well and Matthew Shank as well to the table for our last panelist discussion. So, I mean, I think we'll all agree this last session was really fantastic from hearing from all the different perspectives. Yes, one last round of applause for everybody. So I entered this session at I think the session before, I was reflecting to our team when we were thinking and innovating pie in the sky, what were the sort of things we could do. And I was reflecting that one of my most memorable experiences of seeing interprofessional educational activity around social determinants was in Ethiopia when I was visiting a rural site. And it was in Addis Ababa University, but many African medical schools do this community-based education, but they send interprofessional teams to the rural site. So in Zohray village, they send the public health student, the medical student, even sometimes the engineering student, and they stay there for 3 to 4 weeks, and they work at the health clinic with the understaffed health providers. The faculty don't go, but visiting intermittently. And that interdisciplinary team is left there to assess the community needs and to design and develop a project. And they even have a handoff to teams that come after that. So in my head, I was really sitting around thinking that experiential learning really happens in the community. But this last hour and a half or 2 hours, I was really struck by the number of examples and the variety of experiences we heard from the community itself, but then even bringing speakers into the classroom, self-reflection, interviews. I mean, there was just so much richness in what we just heard, dance classes. I think we've really heard a lot about variety of experiential learning that there is out there. So let me start with that question. From those in the audience, we're all coming from different perspectives. Are there other examples of experiential learning that you can share with us to further enrich in this discussion? Because I think what we're taking from this conversation are the examples. So is there anyone who might have an additional example to sort of share?
I want to share an example from the East End of London. I worked in the East End where there is huge diversity. There's 186 different languages spoken, of which only 160 of them have any written form. And I was having great problems. I was the director of nursing and quality. I was having great problems with my chief executive understanding some of the challenges that our very diverse community faced when they went to accident emergency services. And I was trying to figure out, how do I get this white middle-aged CEO to actually understand that? So I had this idea. I spoke to some of the community liaison people, and we agreed that we could visit the Chinese elders and the Bangladeshi elders group, and for Peter to see the different profiles that they experienced. Now, neither Peter or I spoke Sylheti or Chinese Mandarin, so we were very much fish out of water in their community. And Peter found this an incredibly disturbing experience because he didn't know whether what he was saying was being translated, whether people were... And after the event, and of course what he saw was two very different communities. In the Chinese community, people in their late 80s into their early hundreds, running around, playing mahjong and everything. And in the Sylheti community, where diabetes, cardiovascular incidence was very prevalent, people that were really quite young and very, very disabled. So he got an understanding of the different nature of health needs within different communities. But what was more important was the frustration that he experienced in terms of being in that environment where he didn't know what was happening. And I said to Peter, I said, so just think about it. You went to visit these communities voluntarily. You are mentally healthy, as well as any of us are. And you found it incredibly stressful and frustrating. Just imagine what it would be like if your wife, your child, was coming into the accident emergency department and you were not able to communicate some of those issues. So really trying to connect an emotional experience with that And for him, it was kind of life-changing. He then really realized that we really need to do an awful lot better in terms of how we serve diverse communities within that kind of context.
That really threads through that idea of the relationship that we've heard through many of the examples. So I have a question for each of the panelists, and maybe you can all reflect on this. I mean, we've heard numerous examples. Some appear to be sort of high resource, some low resource, but they all seem common sense. Like in a way, it seems like, of course, we should be training that way. Why doesn't that exist everywhere? So can you reflect for a moment, why doesn't this scale and spread easily? Why are we not just immersed in these kind of experiences when they make so much sense? They're so powerful. We've all agreed. So either reflect on the challenges of why they don't scale and spread, or as an administrator and a president of the university, as Matthew is, reflect on what it takes to scale and spread, because it seems obvious, but it's not happening.
I guess I would start from the administrator perspective, and you all know this, and I think it was said before, but if you don't have passion at the top for this, it's not going to work. And I don't care how many great faculty you have and how passionate they are and how well-intentioned they are, but if it's not part of the vision of the university, I would go that far as to say the president or the CEO or whatever the organization is, they have to constantly be talking about this. And then even more importantly, not only communicate it, but incentivizing people to do it, because we're all human. We want incentives for doing a lot more work, and it is a lot more work. And so we would try to tie in not only tenure decisions to this, but also community engagement grants that we would offer up and received funding for through the corporate world. So I think, again, nothing that you don't know, but I would just stress the importance of whoever the senior leaders are, they have to be on board and they have to be talking about it and they have to experience it themselves to really make it work.
I think for me, there's some appreciation at the top. They put our experiences in the various newsletters to raise funds, for example. But they don't really understand. And let me just give you an example. You know the course we talked about, the refugee health course. The refugee families have to be chosen. We have to seek funds for the stipends. When the students go to the refugee families for the first time, somebody has to take them, and I usually am the one who takes them. Love has done it too. But out of the 10 families, I do about 9 of the home visits, and then later in the semester, there's 3 home visits per semester. So later in the semester, as long as there's 2 of them, they can go together. Good. But one of the people in my department, who's a lovely human being who I see eye to eye with on a lot of things, he said, well, you know, the problem is there's really just not enough students. You got 10 from upstate, 10 from SU. It's not enough for us to make money. So if you could only have 30 families, that would give you 60 students. I said, how do you think we choose the families? I mean, they're not like waiting outside, just ready to be picked up, or they're not at the grocery store, right? And then who's going to do all those 60 home visits while teaching 2 other classes and running a research project?
I'm going to say something unsexy. Logistics, right? So in my former position, I led North Carolina AHAC, which was founded in the early 70s as a commitment to rural communities across North Carolina with distributed education. When I came in, I thought, well, do we really need housing? And the answer is we absolutely need housing. We put together 60,000 nights a year of housing all across the state. Now, leaving aside the interprofessional experience that happens when different professions live in the same house, it's absolutely critical to enable that by doing it, because it will not happen if they're going to rural areas unless you've figured out where they're going to stay.
Safety.
I mean, and then there's an issue of, in an urban environment, we were talking with Terri about, all right, safety. I've certainly had this with international programs, and I've personally had students assaulted in other countries. So you're always worried about that issue, but the housing or whatever it is, it's the bus route, it's the transportation. Unless you figure that out, that's something that will extend it over a long period of time.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add.
Useful. I mean, it really does come down to the nuts and bolts of really doing it and investing in it and having the champions. Any questions from the audience for our panelists who have kind of shared the design or were reflecting on the design element of these experiential learning pieces, or any element, actually? Any comments?
We often focus on the learning that's very positive, but sometimes there's as much to learn from the things that went wrong. So what's something that you would do very differently from your experiences that would shift it a gear?
I had a student raped in Guatemala. That made me forever concerned about safety, and sort of how do you manage travel and other issues, and the same thing could happen, probably not in rural North Carolina actually, but in urban areas. So I mean, that's one kind of safety experience which you can't avoid. I mean, you have to pay attention to that. I think the other issue for me, and this is more kind of routine, but if you send learners to places that aren't ready for them, so they show up and they don't know that they're supposed to come, and they don't know who they are, and the faculty don't know what the curriculum is, what you've done is taken a student who was leaning in the right direction and alienated them. So it's not worth doing unless it's done well, and that you've got faculty development and you've got objectives and that sort of thing. So I'd be, rather than expanding hugely, I would be careful about the experience you get on, because what you need, particularly in this Facebook age, is you start a new experience and they talk about it, and then, with one visit, it's been voted out. There's a very quick rush to judgment. So I would also say putting quality in to begin with is really important.
I would just add one other thing from managing expectations, sort of similar to what you're saying, but I always spent a lot of time managing client expectations and making sure that they understood these are students at the end of the day. And in my classes, they were learning the content as they were going out into the community. And so I would have a lot of time discussions with the clients, I'm calling them clients, about, what can you expect from these students? What are you going to get at the end of this project that's a deliverable? And how are we going to communicate this so that it moves forward after this class is over? So I just would throw that in there. It's not only expectations on the student side, but it's expectations on the client side, and what are their responsibilities in this process?
I think it's very important when we talk about faculty passion that we also talk about why students are in the community. So the reality is that sometimes students engage because it looks good on their CV, and that's really their motivation. And what I would say is there have been times that there have been opportunities that we've been maybe a little too anxious to respond to, with students who were also anxious to respond, but yet were not, and I'm thinking about Noble's point about being intentional. They were intentional, but their intention was not the same intention that we had. So I think that, and it really goes back to Warren's point about how widely are we spread and how much thought we put into where we are. And so that's something that I've been better at, is really considering the students who are going, and again, I continue to maintain that all students need to be engaged, but not everyone can be engaged at the outset. Sometimes it takes a few years for students to really get to the point where they have the adequate knowledge and ethos to be engaged. So that would be what I would say I've learned.
The other thing I would say is do better with hurricanes. What I mean by that is that there are opportunities that come up, that there's rebuilding. If you've been in a place that's had 40 inches of rain, it changes your life. And we've gotten better about organizing that, so the help is actually, students of all professions love to join, but then how do you do it in a way that is actually helpful? And it's a great way to do some teaching about, well, who's taking care of people where we came from? How are we helping? We're not doing it for ourselves, right? At Provo, we're doing it to try to help someplace. And then there are, how do you take advantage of other crises? I mean, when did all of you begin dealing with opiates? For me, it was a town meeting with a pharmacy student with me 7 years ago, where the town was gathering because they had this town of 10,000 had 4 heroin deaths in a 6-month period. And they were saying, we've got to stop. And we brought learners in at every phase, as that, you bring in pharmacy, you bring in all the different learners. But how do we take advantage of those situations in which, there's only one opiate crisis. It's really unusual as far as crises go. But how do we take advantage in a constructive way of what all the students wanted? If they do it, then every student who participated in this had their lives changed, just because of the enormity of the event.
Absolutely. So I've had the experience a couple of times of people burning bridges with the community, sending fellow faculty members to a meeting right a few blocks away, and it was safe, and they didn't go, or they were not responsive enough. They're nice people. They were probably trying their best, but we have a real town and gown kind of issue, and they offended people. And one time, and I've been much, much more careful about following up with this, but with a master's student, I thought, wouldn't it be really nice if you could actually crunch some numbers from the NICU? I know the person at the NICU, let's go over there. And so we got all this permission, got this database of babies who were mostly neonatal abstinence syndrome babies, and completely de-identified, IRB approval, everything. And then the student didn't follow through. She said she was doing it, but she wasn't. I didn't. Now I do. Should have checked in with the NICU people, but we had the data in our area. I didn't. I still kick myself about that. Anyway, it was a failure, and they were upset with me, understandably, because I didn't follow through. But, it's learning, right?
I think we've reflected a lot of some neat things, and I think if I were to summarize what I think we're hearing is that in order to do this well, it requires thoughtful leadership, intentional resources allocated appropriately for quality of the activity, and then intentionality, both from the learner's perspective and from the educational institution perspective. So thank you for all of you. I think it's great.
Is that okay? Yes.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a fantastic day. I don't know about you, but I feel really energized by the discussions, and just truly appreciate the contribution of all of the speakers today. We are going to adjourn for the afternoon, and we'll start bright and early at 8 a.m. Looking forward to see everybody again tomorrow, and have a peaceful evening.